It's the time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through our YouTube page, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, you may not think it, but just like congregations in Appalachia, we here at MCC Boston believe in the practice of handling snakes. In Mark 16:18, it says, "They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." But unlike the Holiness Pentecostals or the charismatic congregations in Appalachia, the snakes that we handle here at MCC Boston are the perpetuators of homophobia and transphobia in our world. These serpents obscure the true message of the Bible that God's love is infinite and is given inclusively to all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Through its message of God's inclusive love, MCC has made great strides in eradicating the guilt and shame that often plagues our queer siblings, leaving them vulnerable to the serpent's helpmate of self-hatred. MCC Boston is in the business of laying on hands to cure the sickness of transphobia and homophobia, empowering the queer community to reclaim its rightful place within the family of God. That's why it's so important that the work of MCC Boston and the messages of our denomination continue to be heard all over the globe. So this week, be proud of your association with this church and make a pledge to keep helping MCC Boston handle any and all snakes that separate our communities from a loving Creator.
A reading from the Epistle to the Hebrews. You have not come to something that can be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that not another word be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even an animal touches the mountain, it shall be stoned to death. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse the one who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused the one who warned them on earth, how much less will we escape if we reject the one who warns from heaven? At that time, God's voice shook the earth, but now God has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of what is shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Let us give thanks by which we offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe. For indeed, our God is a consuming fire.
In all the time I have been preaching, I have never struggled to comprehend a text as much as I did with this one, which is one of the reasons I hardly ever work with epistles. I understand things better through narrative than through exposition. Even so, though, I certainly have worked with epistolary writings before, and none of them has ever confounded me nearly so much as this text from Hebrews. It just felt like a bit of jumbled nonsense. First, there's this whole treatise on the intangibility, the untouchableness of the divine. And then this eschatological vision of Christian ascendance in the New Jerusalem, and then the old warning, the repent now, the same admonition not to waste time that we see over and over in Christian dialogue, which I'm kind of tired of. And all of those pieces make sense on their own, but I just couldn't grasp the relationship between the points. What does this first paragraph have to do with the second and third? I spent weeks meditating on this passage and reading up on it and couldn't for the life of me begin to make sense. And then it hit me. I was meant to have been frightened by the first paragraph. The something that cannot be touched, the darkness, the tempest, the gloom, and the blazing fire are supposed to be scary. I didn't understand that at first because I thought it obvious that the thing that you have not come to was God or faith or some equivalent. And I expect God to be impalpable. I expect to find God in the darkness and the storm and the inferno, and my response to that has always been a sort of awe and wonder. To fear it didn't occur to me because it's God, and I believe God loves me. But reading it as something which is meant to terrify us makes sense of the passage. Though there are a lot of questions about Hebrews, scholars are generally agreed that Hebrews was intended to be a letter of encouragement to a persecuted community. That the cultural context of this letter is that its audience are living in a society that continues to persecute them for being part of the early Jesus movement. And that the writer wants to inspire that audience to stay the course, to endure the hardships and oppression that early Jesus followers faced for the hope of a greater reward at the end of that persecution. So the audience reading this letter would have the understanding that in coming closer to God through Jesus, they were approaching something scary and dangerous in a way that I will never understand because I haven't had that experience. Read in this way, there's an understandable progression. The writer acknowledges that the audience in coming to faith is approaching something that is threatening, that could be the reason they suffer great harm and possibly death. So the writer first acknowledges that they understand how the audience feels about the dangers of professing their newfound faith, and then encourages them by giving them a picture of the hope that they possess for the time after these trials are finished. There's a contrast between the hardship and fear of the present age and the considerable celebration that will come with the dawning of a new era. This reading makes a lot more sense. It does, however, risk being flattened into any of 1,000 more simplistic interpretations. One could easily read through this as yet another admonition that though Jesus' followers may face trial in the current days, they will be rewarded in the end. And they should not waste their opportunity to heed God's warning so they can partake in the reward. I think there's more nuance to be seen in this text, though, and I think in a way it starts with my misunderstanding. Now, here's the angle I'm considering. You may not know this, but during my time in seminary, I was known among the student body for my fascination with the study of self-flagellation as a spiritual practice. Anytime any professor made even the briefest passing reference to that Christian tradition of going into a closet and whipping yourself, I could count on at least 5 heads turning back to look at me every single time. There are a lot of reasons for my interest in this topic, and you're free to ask me about that after the service. But the important thing is, because of this interest, I have done a fair bit of research into the phenomenon of pain. And one thing I've learned through that research is that it's very difficult to get a handle on what pain actually is. You could say it's an unpleasant physical sensation, but that's detached understatement. You can describe it metaphorically, stabbing, shooting, burning pain. You can explain it through examples of painful incidents, like you closed a car door on your finger. But it's quite difficult to actually say what pain truly is other than something that hurts. One way to make sense of it, though, is simply as an excess of feeling. For instance, if I lightly tap this podium, I will feel it. It won't hurt, but I'll have physical sensation. If I hit this podium with a considerable degree of force, it will hurt me, and it does. The excess force makes for an excess of physical sensation. So then pain is, in a way, just too much feeling. And you could say this of any negative experience. Danger, fear, persecution, it's all the result of some normally existing force that is present in too great a quantity for us to withstand. It's all just too much of something. The tempest is too much rain, too much wind. The inferno is too much heat. The darkness is too little light, too little clarity. All of these things are healthy in some quantity, and in fact, we could not survive without them. But humans are frail creatures, and we can easily be killed by too high a quantity of the forces we rely on. A few years ago, I made the mistake of coming back from P-Town on the Monday morning ferry. It was a terrible decision. It was too hot, it was crowded, the line took forever, there was nowhere to sit, I was miserable. But during that boat ride, I also found myself looking out on the water and seeing the sun hit the surface and feeling that heat and light beating down on my own head, and I was struck with the thought that God was there too. That aside from being with us in our daily lives and our personal gatherings, God was also palpably present in those places that would kill us, in those extremities. God resides in the volcano. God lives on the steep mountaintop and the freezing tundra and the empty desert. God is in the harsh sun beating down on the water and burning my skin. And God, too, is in the vastness of the water that cannot be warmed even by the sun but a few feet below the surface. That God herself, though as near to me as my own heart and as gentle as a mother's kiss, is also a blazing fire and heat that cannot be controlled. That God herself is too much. And so it is not unreasonable for the community receiving the epistle to Hebrews to fear God. As we've heard in this text, God is indeed too much for humanity to bear, which is why the ancient Israelites took such caution when communicating with her. And it is not unreasonable for humanity to fear in general. There are so many forces in this world that nurture us that are also fatal to us when they become too much. Flooding, hurricanes, drought, fire, bacteria. We are frail beings, and in so many ways this earth we live in and the God who created us are fearsome in just how too much they can be, in how easily they could kill us when the force becomes excessive. And we all know that those forces can become excessive. So the fear present in the community being written here is reasonable. Why shouldn't they fear a God whose grandiosity of power could so easily destroy them by simple exposure without meaning to? And we all face the same dilemma, but we've mostly found ways around the too muchness of the world. When there's too much rain, we channel it away from us. When there's too much heat, we have AC, we have shade, we have fans. When there is fire, we douse it. When there are high winds, we build shelter. When there is too much darkness, we light a candle. Our entire society in this way is constructed around protecting us from the too muchness of our world. We have found ways to keep ourselves safe from all of these too muches. It would be entirely reasonable for any of us to decide to stay away from the powerful force of the God who could kill us and stay safe behind our walls where we can largely protect ourselves from the too muches, from a God who literally bills herself as a consuming fire. But the systems we have built to protect us from these too muches are unreliable and often do more harm than good. We have discovered technology that will keep us cool in high temperatures, but while doing so, it makes the weather even hotter. We've established groups of people who can protect us from wild beasts and wild men alike who wait in the darkness for the chance to strike, but we now must fear those same people tasked with preserving our safety because they can too easily perceive us as a threat to someone else's safety. We've trained others to protect us from the conquering army, and we've developed considerable technology to assist them in this, but every piece of technology we develop to keep us safer can be used by others to threaten us even more. We can build houses and walls to keep us safe from the rain and wind, and though they are less frail than we are, they still fall all too easily and often take us with them. We can build a fire for warmth in the winter, but if it gets out of hand, it can ruin our shelter and fill us with smoke. All of the systems we've developed to keep us safe from the too muchness of the world, all of them are insufficient at best, and at worst present an even graver threat than that which we intended to shield ourselves against. Even the very persecution that early Jesus followers faced was rooted in the natural inclination of humankind to band together in groups and villages for safety. We as humans are eternally caught between the dangers of the world we live in, the dangers of a God too powerful for us to be unshielded in her presence, and of the dangers of the world we've created, and none of them will give us the safety we wish for. But in religious context, fire is most often perceived as divine punishment. We jump right to the flames of hell. But God, too, is a consuming fire, and it is helpful to remember that fire does not only destroy, but also purifies. Paul writes elsewhere about a fire that will test our works, a fire that will separate those things we've wrought which are good and holy, and those which are empty and meaningless. In much the same way that this passage speaks of shaking the foundations of the earth, so that those things which can be shaken will be destroyed and only the unshakable will remain. I believe that all these systems, all this technology, everything we've developed ourselves to protect us from the world, all these things can be shaken and defeated, and someday they inevitably will be. So that leaves us with the choice between a God who is too much for us and a world we've created that is too little to protect us from a world we've inherited that is also too much for us. There would appear to be no safe option, which is entirely the point. The writer of this letter wants the reader to know that though God is not by any means a safe refuge from persecution and harm, that in fact loyalty to God demands exposing ourselves to more persecution and harm through service to the poor and others suffering, but that God is our only hope that is certain, the only force that can keep us safe from the dangers of the world if we learn to serve her and trust her. And this God is still entirely too powerful for us, as this text's references to Sinai demonstrate. Even the livestock who would face God unmediated must be killed because they would sustain too much damage from encountering God. However, this process of refinement by fire is not only one by which God will make the world stronger, but it is also a process through which God can make us stronger. There are many loud voices in American Christianity who like to tell us that salvation is a one-time event, that a person reaches out to God and God saves them, and that's the end of it. But I'm a Wesleyan, and we believe that this moment of redemption is but the beginning of a journey towards sanctification, that as surely as God saves us from ourselves, God also continues to save us by working with us to become better, stronger, able to withstand fire and remain unshaken. That God will lead us to transcend our human fears and doubts and frailties if we follow her and trust the process. In my academic studies on self-flagellation, I also had the opportunity to learn a little more about BDSM communities. And before I say anything else, let me just say how grateful I am to be part of a faith tradition where I feel comfortable talking about BDSM as a sermon illustration. God bless the MCC. But I do think that in considering the process by which we are gradually made stronger and more able to withstand the too muchness of God, it is useful to look at those who have built infrastructure to deal with the too muchness of pain in the plainest, most literal sense. These communities have created ways to respect the limits of pain tolerance that each of us has. They use safe words. They'll sometimes make agreements and contracts, and they keep consent always at the center of the conversation. They have created boundaries. Now, those boundaries themselves can easily be disrespected or used to manipulate others, but the boundaries themselves aren't really the point. The boundaries only serve as a way to develop trust between or among those participating. What keeps a sub safe isn't a safe word, but the knowledge that their dom will respect that safe word, which they'll know because their dom has respected that safe word in the past. This means that there's a gradual process by which participants build trust in one another, and as that trust builds, each may feel safer pushing their limits and getting more comfortable. This is in no way a perfect analog to our relationship with God because we worship a God who cannot be bound. whose very existence defies boundaries, whose very nature cannot be limited. So we cannot put boundaries around God until we've learned to trust her. But we can still participate in a process of building trust and pushing our limits in order to grow into people more readily able to encounter God. I never lose my place. I hate when that happens. Sorry. As she is, to encounter God as she is, in all her too muchness. And while there are no safe words to be used, we can also rest assured that God knows us and knows just how to lead us through that process of trust building and refinement at the pace that is best for us, that God speaks our language and knows how to communicate with us in such a way that she knows we'll hear it. That God is keenly aware of where our limits are, and we can gradually build trust enough to know that God will respect our limits and will give us the time to push those further. There is a story that I have often only half told, because there are elements of it that I prefer not to share with those who would not understand or believe. But I think this is the right time to tell it publicly. Last fall, I was praying one night, as I do every night. And one thing that I love about having developed a strong prayer practice is that sometimes I'll get to the end and say amen, and I'll think to myself, wow, I don't know where any of that, what I just said, just came from. I guess it was just something I needed to say, but the words I speak can come out as a genuine surprise even to me, completely unthought, unknown until that moment. And I had one of those prayers that night, and what I said essentially was, God, I feel like I'm getting better at trusting you and knowing that you will look after me. But God, I am still human and still frail, and there are some leaps of faith that I can't bring myself to take just yet. So I want you to know that if there is a leap of faith that I need to take, but I can't bring myself to do it, I give you full permission to give me a push, and I will still trust you if you do. And I finished that prayer, and I thought to myself, where did that come from? The very next day, in a complete blindside, I was fired from my job. And I couldn't exactly be angry with God about it because I had given her full permission. It was an experience that was humiliating and infuriating and unjust, and I'm still working all of that out with my therapist. And it was the best thing that could have possibly happened, partly because I hated that job. But also, losing that job began a journey that has led to a deeper faith, an unleashing of creativity, a newfound confidence in my own power, and a life rooted in profound contentment. And all of that happened because I developed enough trust in God to say, take action in my life because I trust you to do what is best for me. This level of trust is a process. It takes refinement. It won't always go smoothly. It is a consuming fire and a shaking of our foundations. And yet it is our salvation. It will guide and protect us far better than we could ever do ourselves if we only listen and grow, if we only trust that the hardships thrown in our path do not come across us without God's knowledge, and that she can be trusted to protect us from the hardships that would ruin us and to embrace those hardships that would help us grow. The people being written to in Hebrews are right to fear God because a life of obedience to God will often entail persecution and hardship, and much will be asked of those of us who are faithful. And yet those who persevere know that this obedience to God will also keep us safe, so much more certainly than we can do ourselves. And those who trust in God will find, I truly believe, that with each step beyond our boundaries, we develop deeper trust in God and greater knowledge that she is with us and guiding us to the right path every day of our lives, even through the fire. If we can only learn how to listen to her, to trust her, to take the leap when it appears before us, or failing that, at least to let God give us a push. Thank you.